Testing, testing. No. Okay. You're ready to start.
Well, good evening, and welcome to the seventh blessing of the Shmone Esrei. For those who are tuning in for the first time, Shmone Esrei is the central prayer of Judaism, recited 3 times every weekday. It's also recited on Shabbos, Sabbath, and holidays, but it's a shortened version with some variations. This prayer is also known as the Amidah, the standing prayer, because we stand when we say the prayer. And it contains 3 sections. The first 3 blessings are praises of God before we ask Him for our needs. The last 3 blessings are expressions of gratitude for having provided us with our needs. And the middle blessings, the 13 middle ones, are the requests. Now, if you did your math, 3 plus 3 plus 13 is 19, because even though it's called Shmone Esrei, which means 18, we're a little bit creative here. We added on a 19th that was inserted later on, but it still retains the name Shmone Esrei, 18. And we're up to the 7th blessing. Now, we're focusing now on the requests. The first request we had was for knowledge. The second request we had was for God to help us return to Him if we have strayed. And the third blessing is where we ask God for forgiveness. And right after this, we ask God for redemption. And this blessing, which I'll read right now in translation, and then we'll uh, introduce some of the ideas that are mentioned here, then we'll go into it specifically. The prayer reads, "Please behold our oppression and wage our battle. Redeem us speedily for the sake of your name. For you, God, are a strong Redeemer. Blessed are you, God, Redeemer of Israel." This is a very brief prayer, and doesn't take very long to say, but if we analyze every bit of it, it can take us quite a long time to understand the nuances here. But it's interesting, the Midrash says that this blessing was recited first by the angels. Actually, the Midrash has this for every one of the blessings, that each one of these blessings was originally composed by the angels at a time in history when this particular type of blessing became relevant. When the Jews were liberated from Egypt at the time of the Exodus, the angel said the blessing, "Blessed are you, God, who redeems the Jewish people, who redeems Israel." Now, it's about redemption. Is it about individual redemption, or is it about the ultimate redemption? There are different sources that seem to suggest both options. For example, if you go to Rashi's commentary on the Talmud discusses all these blessings. Rashi seems to suggest, he doesn't suggest it, he says it very clearly, that this is not about collective redemption. It's not about the ultimate redemption of the Jewish people from exile. This is about personal redemption from one's personal problems and issues. Or it's about the problems that we have now in exile. Before we get out of exile, we have to also survive in exile. And this is a request for the redemption from all of our suffering and pain, whereas the term that's used over here, our oppression. In Hebrew, the word is v'anyenu. So, according to Rashi, uh, he makes it clear that this is a request for personal redemption. On the other hand, the Midrash implies that it's about the redemption in general. It's about the ultimate redemption. There's an interesting story in the Gemara In the beginning of the Talmud, there's a story that a certain sage, Rabbi Yossi, was traveling and he walked into a room to pray. And Elijah the prophet was standing there waiting for him to go out, and he chastised him for praying in a room. And he said, "You should have prayed while you were on the road." And it's a whole long discussion, legally speaking, whether you're supposed to go into a room, it's too dangerous, or this or that. Well, one of the commentators of the Talmud explains what was going on over there. What was the debate between Rabbi Yossi and Elijah? And he says, Rabbi Yossi went into a room. He's talking about one of the ruins of Jerusalem, and that he was praying for the end of exile. He wanted the Messianic age. He wanted the rebuilding of Jerusalem. That's what it means that he walked into the ruins. Not just literally that he was in a ruin, he was praying for the rebuilding of the ruins. Elijah says, no, no, no. Now is not the time to pray for the future redemption. Pray, he says, you should have prayed on the road. Pray for good things happening even when we're on the road to redemption. You can't just pray for redemption. You have to pray that things shall go good on the road. And this commentary says, and that's what this blessing is about. This blessing is about that the trip should be a pleasant trip. Not only that we should get to our destination, but the road to the destination should also not be beset with all sorts of suffering and pain. But in truth, these two sources are not conflicting sources. The source that says it's about personal redemption, it's about redemption from persecution within the period of exile, doesn't contradict the one that it is dealing with the ultimate redemption, because the two redemptions are intertwined and interwoven. Because there's no such thing as communal redemption without personal redemption, and its personal redemption is empowered by the forces of the general redemption. There's an interesting midrash. Rabbi Gamliel had a neighbor, apparently, who was a widow, and he once heard her crying about her plight, and that reminded him to say the prayer, to cry for the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. When he heard an individual crying, this reminded him of the collective sorrow of the Jewish people and to pray for that. So he said what is called Tikkun Chatzos, the midnight prayer. There's a prayer that very few people are aware of, and most people never say this prayer, but usually it was reserved for very spiritual elite people. But in the middle of the night, midnight to be specific, they would sit on the ground, someone would put ashes on their head, and they would say a special prayer. It's printed in some prayer books, and the idea behind it is to lament the destruction of the temple. And after that, they would study Torah the rest of the night. And this Rabbi Gamliel, when he heard the pain and suffering of an individual, that reminded him of the collective pain and suffering. Now, of course, he'd say, well, he should have helped the widow. I'm sure he did. But the cries of the widow reminded him of the collective communal cries. There's a story about the great sage who lived about 350 years ago. Is known as the Bach, not to be confused with the composer. This was the composer of commentary on the Code of Jewish Law, and his notes are printed on the margin of every edition of the Talmud. His name was Rabbi Yoel Sirkish, and he wrote a major commentary on the Code of Law, and whenever he tried to publish it, something went wrong. There was always some type of a glitch, and it didn't get published. And he was really agonizing over it. I'm working on this for years, and it doesn't get published. And one night, he said to himself, you know what? I'm doing something wrong. I'm worried about my work, and I haven't expressed my pain and sorrow that the divine presence is in exile, and I'm not crying over the destruction of the temple. So that night, at midnight, he said this midnight prayer, which he hadn't said in many years. And in his dream, God comes to him and tells him that all those years that you were focused on your commentary, you didn't say this midnight prayer. Now that you're saying the midnight prayer, your prayers will be heard. And the next day, the publishing of his work commenced. It's another interesting fact. The Rebbe would have people would come to him at night. He would have the private audiences starting 8 p.m. It would go all night. And I heard that whenever someone was in the Rebbe's room at midnight, the Rebbe, of course, didn't interrupt and say, I have to say a prayer now, but he would always steer the conversation to deal with the temple in Jerusalem. No matter what the subject was, if he was talking to a scientist about science and Torah, he would steer it to the temple. If he was talking to a simple person about their problems of illness, he would somehow always direct. And that's the general theme, that individual redemption relates to the general redemption, and the general redemption is reflected also in the individual redemption. So both versions are true. This is personal redemption on the road, and it's also about the ultimate redemption. Because in another way of putting it, how do you prepare for something holy? By doing something holy. How do you prepare for redemption? Through redemption. When you redeem yourself, when you ask God for redemption from your own personal problems, spiritual problems as well as material and physical problems, that's how you prepare for the ultimate redemption. One other very important point which reinforces this idea: when a person, God forbid, suffers a bereavement and we come to comfort the mourner, the traditional prayer or blessing that we say when we are about to take leave is, may the omnipresent one comfort you among the other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. We're talking to one individual, and we're talking about being comforted among the mourners of Zion in Jerusalem. So the Rebbe once wrote in a letter, this is written to General Sharon, when right after the 6-Day War, he lost a child by some freak accident with a gun, and the Rebbe wrote this letter to comfort him. And one of the things the Rebbe pointed out, why does the blessing connect this individual person's grief with the destruction of the temple? Because the person who is suffering from this loss has to realize that we're all suffering together, that their suffering is a reflection of the communal suffering, and the communal suffering is a reflection of the individual suffering. The Maharal, one of the greatest Jewish thinkers, lived about 400 plus years ago, writes that when the Jews were liberated from Egypt, it was a revolution in terms of the human condition. The question could be asked, what is the human condition? Are we essentially not free people, and we have to superimpose freedom on us? By nature, we're subordinated people, we're beholden to others, and we're controlled by others and circumstances, and we have to impose freedom on ourselves? Or is our innate default position free? Are we a free people that sometimes could be enslaved, but that's not who we are? We are essentially free. So the Maharal says that at the time of the Exodus, it didn't just free us, it changed us, that we are not capable of being anything but free. That's who we are. That's our natural state. And that's the concept of intrinsic freedom, that we are intrinsically a free people. And that's what redemption is about. It's about awakening the freedom within us, that we should experience and feel the freedom that we have by nature. It's not something that comes from the outside, it's something that comes from within. Okay, so we know that this is a blessing, asking God for redemption, personal, communal redemption. It's connected to the preceding blessings. The first thing you have to ask God is for knowledge, because if you don't have knowledge, you don't know what you're lacking. You can't ask for anything. The second thing we ask for is that God should help us return to Him, because if we're not in any way connected to God, then anything else that follows is meaningless. But that's still not enough. We need forgiveness. We have to have a clean slate before we can be redeemed. Because if a person does not have spiritual redemption, then they can't have emotional and physical redemption. Because when you're essentially not free internally, you don't experience that internal freedom, then all the other freedoms don't really help you. The truth is that people say we're living in a free country. Well, the only thing that's really free is the air. There's nothing else that's free in this country. But it's much more than that. We are so enslaved to everything. Technology, for example, this is the ultimate master in people's lives. You can't walk anywhere without your cell phone. It becomes part of you. People are hiding their cell phones here. It won't help. So we're slaves to every whim, to every fad, to every uh, part of technology that comes up. We're beholden to so many things besides the traditional types of slavery, uh, to organizations, to institutions. We are not free physically, but if we're free spiritually, then the other types of slavery don't really impose anything on us. You can be free in a physical way. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're free. So the first thing we have is we need for forgiveness before we can ask God for ultimate freedom and redemption on all levels. Now, we're asking God for redemption. And we're asking Him for redemption uh, quickly. We'll get back to that in a moment. This is the seventh blessing. There's some Kabbalah over here I'm going to leave for the end if we have time. This is the seventh blessing. Why is it the seventh blessing? There's a connection to everything. The Talmud makes the connection. The Talmud says that the ultimate redemption will occur in the seventh year. It means there's a 7-year cycle of things that will happen in the world. In the seventh year, there will be wars. And at the post-sabbatical year, that will be the redemption. So the number 7 is connected to the wars that will precede the redemption. It doesn't necessarily mean literally. It's conceptually, the redemption is connected to wars, to battles. There might very well have been battles in the past that were the wars that we needed to go through for the redemption. But redemption follows a struggle. And the struggle is considered to be the beginning of the redemptive process. The struggle itself is part of the redemption. Now, the number 7 is represented by the Hebrew letter Zion. If you want to write 7 in Hebrew, you write a letter Zion. What does Zion mean? Zion means a weapon. That this blessing is our weapon to wage war against the forces within us, internally, and then ultimately externally, to be able to get out of exile. So the war itself, the struggle itself, is part of the redemptive process. There's a whole discussion about Purim. Purim is on the 14th day of the month, and that's when we read the Megillah. The Talmud says that if you lived in a small town and it was hard for the small townspeople to hear the Megillah because they would have to go to the big city, and they didn't go every day, they only would go Mondays and Thursdays, they allowed them to read the Megillah at other occasions as well. And the Talmud says that they can read the Megillah on the 13th day of the month. Why the 13th? Because that was the time when the war was waged. That's when everyone gathered to fight. That means that even while the war is being waged, and things that are seven. But this is how the Midrash describes the importance of the seventh. It says, when God created the world, his presence was felt in this world, only to depart, withdraw when Adam and Eve partook of the forbidden fruit. When Cain killed Abel, God's presence withdrew another stage to another heaven. And the seven different sins caused the divine presence to withdraw to the seventh heaven. Abraham was the first one to bring it back down to the sixth, Isaac to the fifth, and 7 generations followed, a total of 7. Moses, who was the seventh, and all sevens are beloved, brought the divine presence down back here on earth. So 7 is the one that completes the task of bringing passed away. He submitted a discourse for publication to be studied on the day that he passed away. It was his grandmother's yahrzeit, and he was intended to deliver a discourse on one of the 20 chapters of that discourse. And the Rebbe did 2 different cycles of that. So there's two volumes, about 600-700 pages. Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Shneir Zalman, and it's our task to bring the divine presence back down on earth, bring about the king squanders all his treasures, and he gives everything that he has, treasures that he stored for generation, that is endowed with the greatest treasures, enabling us to win this war. So that's what the number 7 represents. It's the final battle, and the number 7 all tie in with that. Okay, now we get to the blessing itself. Please behold our oppression. In Hebrew, the word behold is re'eh. Re'eh means to see. We're asking God to see our oppression. Sometimes in our prayers, we ask God to listen to our cries. We're learning about that right now in the Torah portion. Jews are slaves in Egypt, and God hears their cries. You hear someone's cry, but seeing is different from hearing. What's the difference between God seeing and God hearing? Well, what's the difference between our seeing and hearing? The difference is that when you hear something, even if it's believable, it doesn't affect you as deeply, as profoundly as when you see it. That's why did people oppose the Vietnam War? Because they saw the body bags, they saw the devastation. When you're exposed to something and you see it, you will react to it. If you just hear about it, you could assimilate it, and it's terrible, I know, but I won't do anything about it. There's a story in the Talmud, but not a story, but it's about a commentary on Moses. Moses is told by God that your people worship the golden calf. Terrible. Moses goes down with the tablets, and he sees them worshiping the golden calf, and he shatters the tablets. So the Talmud asks, he knew already before that they had worshipped the golden calf. Who did he know that from? He heard it from God. Pretty reliable witness. I don't know, would God be able to testify in a witness stand? Would they accept his testimony? Has another meaning as well. Has 2 other meanings in Hebrew. Na can mean now. Probably the English word now probably came from the Hebrew word na. And na is also used in the context of raw meat. Something is raw, it's na. How do these 3 translations connect? Well, now and raw make sense. If someone says, I want my meat now, but it hasn't cooked yet, it's still raw. Well, you have to give something up if you want it now. Now means I'm taking it the way it is. I'm not waiting for anything more. So what does it have to do with the word please? I think we use the word please. Maybe the word please means what we think it means, but it's not really what the word no means. No means, what I'm saying, when you say please, in Yiddish we used to translate ich bed bei dir. I'm begging you, I'm imploring. That means that is an expression that you can't wait. Now please is just a nicety. We say please, so we shouldn't be rude. But really, the word no is much more than just please, much more than just a nicety. It's saying, God, I need it. I need it so badly that I need it now. I can't wait any longer. And that's probably why the word na is put in. There are some versions that don't have the word na, but most liturgies do have the word na over here. The word v'anyenu, they translate here as our oppression. The root of the word is the same as the word ani, which is poor. Oni, suffering, impoverished, poor, they're all related words. So we're asking God to see our oppression, to see how we are oppressed. Obviously, God knows that we're oppressed, but we're asking Him that it should affect the way He reacts. He shouldn't be indifferent and detached from it, because God has two different modes. There's one mode in which God is beyond everything. In Job, it says, if you do good, does God really care? Does He need it? If you do bad, are you hurting Him? He's beyond everything, and yet we know that God cares. He's like a father. He's like a mother. He cares a lot. Well, we're asking God to be in the mode where He cares, where He sees and is reactive and responsive to our cries, and not be the distant, aloof God. There's an expression in the book of Psalms that God awakens from his sleep, like someone who's asleep. In the book of Esther, where it says that the king's sleep was disturbed, the Talmud says, the Midrash says that refers to God's sleep. In exile, God is asleep. What does that mean? God is asleep? It means God is in a mode where he's withdrawn from us. And it seems that he's not reacting to our needs. So here we're saying, God, we want you to react to our needs. Please see us. React to us. Be in the mode of close God who's responsive to what we need. And then we say to wage our battle. Oh, before we go on, in this prayer, we ask God to see our oppression. What is this oppression all about? What are we asking for? Generally, oppression is a word that makes a lot of sense, but there's a source that seems to suggest that this oppression is referring to not having children. Because where do we find this expression the first time in the Torah? God seeing someone's suffering. When Leah, Jacob's wife, who wasn't the favorite wife of Jacob didn't want to marry her. He was tricked into it. So she probably felt miserable. Not probably, she says it, that she is suffering. So I don't have to guess that she felt miserable. She says it. And then she has her first child. And she names him Ruvain. What does Ruvain mean? So the Torah says why she named him Ruvain. Ra Hashem Ba'ani. God saw my oppression, my suffering. So the first time this prayer was said, this expression, God seeing someone suffering, is in the context of her having a child. There's a question that I once heard someone ask, and I spoke about it many times, and I gave a different answer to it. But it occurred to me today, as I was preparing for the class, that this might be the place where the prayer for children is alluded. Because one of the models for the Shmone Esrei, I think I mentioned this in one of the earlier classes, is the prayer of Hannah, who was the mother of the prophet Samuel. And she prayed for children. And the Talmud derives many of the laws of how we're supposed to pray from her prayer. That when we say the Shmone Esrei, we're not supposed to say it loud, we say it quietly. And many other laws are derived from Hannah. And yet, in all of the Shmone Esrei, where we ask God for all our requests, there's not one request for children. Wouldn't that be an important need for someone who was childless? So there might be other ways of answering that question, but I think this might be the place where that request is really hinted, because this is the source of that expression, God seeing my suffering. Reuven is a composite of Ra'ah, Ru'u is see. Vain is short for the word ba'anyi, my suffering. It also means child, so it can be both things. So this prayer, we're asking God, see our suffering, that God should give us a child. Now, what's the connection to redemption? Well, the connection is very clear. The Talmud says that the redemption will only come about when all the souls that are in the storage house of souls are discharged from the storage house and come into this world. So every time a child is born, we are one step closer to the redemption. So it makes sense that where do you ask God for redemption? Where do you ask God for children, rather, in the prayer for redemption? That's a thought that just came to me today, and I think it has some merit. Okay, then we say wage our battle. I already mentioned before that there are different types of battles. There's the battle we have against evil people, and that's certainly included in this request. But then there's the eternal battle between the godly soul and the animal soul. And the Talmud says that if God would not help us, we could never win. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Berditchev probably explained why that's so with his famous saying to God, God, why did you put all the rewards and all the threats of punishment in the books and the temptations in front of us? You should have done it the other way around. Put the temptations in a book and put all the good stuff in front of us. So since we are biased in favor of our animal soul, because number one, it comes first. Number two, it's something that is closer to our. You don't have to be a sophisticated person to have physical needs and desires.
What do you mean it comes first?
When a person is born, their godly soul isn't yet fully developed in them. It happens at the age of bat or bar mitzvah. That's when their godly soul really fully enters the person. So the animal soul and the Yetzer Hara, the evil impulse, has 13 years of experience and learning all the tricks and knowing how to get us to do whatever it wants. So the godly soul, it's a mismatch, because even though the godly soul is much stronger, we don't have access to it as much, and it's not as doesn't have as much guile and as much. It's not deceptive, and the animal soul is deceptive. So we have to have a little boost from God to win our battles, and that's what this prayer is. We're invoking God's assistance. Please help us in our battles with our evil impulse, with our animal soul. This is reminiscent of the battle that Jacob had with the angel. Who was that angel? It was the angel of Esau. That's the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara, the evil impulse, is an angel. It's one of God's forces in this world. The truth is, even the angel knows what's right and what's wrong, but that's his job. He doesn't. He does his job. His job is to entice us. His job is to cause us to stray, and we have to recognize him for what he is. This expression of wage our battle is found also in the prayer that we say in Hanukkah. There we preface that with the words, Amadata lahem, you stood up for them in their time of distress, and you waged their battle. What does it mean when God stands up for someone? So in Hasidic literature, it explains that standing is where the head is high, and it's directly above the feet, and it's as if we're saying that whatever is up high comes down below. Because when you sit, your head is not so high, and your feet are not so low, because usually when people sit, in the biblical imagery, you're putting your feet on a footstool. So your feet are not so low, and your head is not so high. That's conventional relationship that God has with us. He's not giving us such great energy, and we're not so low. But when we are very low, we need God to stand up, and He has to bring his highest energy down to the lowest place that we may have fallen to. It's like the difference between a good teacher and a phenomenal teacher. A good teacher can teach students that are very bright and very much knowledgeable of the subject. A brilliant teacher could take the most difficult subject and bring it down to a little child. That takes much more brilliance. It means when God stands up for us, we're asking him to take his highest energy because we need to bring it down to the lowest point because we're now in a very life and death struggle and we're at the lowest point in our lives and we need that very high energy to come down to us. Then we say, redeem us speedily for the sake of your name. Why the emphasis on speed? First of all, what does that mean, redeem us speedily, and why the emphasis on speed? The Talmud says, quoting a verse in Isaiah, where it talks about the redemption, that the redemption will be Be'ita, in its time, Achishena, I will hasten it. So the Talmud says that's a contradiction in terms. If it's in its time, there's a fixed time, then it's not going to be hastened. There's a fixed time. And Achishena means I'm going to hasten it, make it earlier. You have an appointment with a doctor, and he says the appointment is in this day, and you cannot change that appointment. Then it's fixed. So what does it mean? Do we have a choice? So the Talmud says it depends. If we do nothing to warrant and to earn the redemption, it'll come in its fixed time, by hook or by crook. Whether we're all good or we're all bad, no matter what the situation is, or anything in between, there's a fixed time. But if we do something that will make us meritorious and refined, then achishena, I will hasten it. I will accelerate the process. That's what we mean over here. We're asking God, yes, I know there's going to be a redemption, ultimately, but we want it speedily. We don't want the fixed time scenario. We want the accelerated scenario. That's the simple meaning of why we're asking to redeem us speedily. But the question is, why are we so gung-ho on having it speedily? What's wrong if it takes a little bit longer? So the answer is given in this very blessing. Although there is another answer that I think everyone can understand, but I'll point to this answer first. For the sake of your name. This is pretty a little bit unfair. We're bribing God in our prayer. We're telling him, you know what? You need it. You need it more than us. You're the one who's suffering in exile. You're the one who no one cares about. You're the one who's being laughed at. You're the one who's being rejected. You're the one who's being desecrated. So for your sake, you should bring the redemption. Not because we want it or we need it, you need it. But the truth is, we need it as much as God needs it for two reasons. Number one, because if God needs it and God is our Father, then we want it for that reason. But even for our own personal reasons, if a person is even a little bit sensitive to what's going on in the world, how could a person not want the redemption? If they don't believe it's ever going to happen, then of course, then why would they pray for it? But if a person does believe, then why would they not want it now? Why would a person say, well, I'm not ready, I still have a few things to do, and then when I get my degree and write my great American novel and make my first million, I settle down and marry off my children, then I'm ready for it. No, we can't wait. There's a song that is very popular amongst children in particular. We want Mashiach now. The word now, no, we don't want to wait. Because if you're sensitive, and you know there's a way of helping, how could you not want it right away? Maimonides writes, if a person doesn't believe in the Mashiach, then he's denying the Torah, or if he doesn't wait for it, if he doesn't anticipate it, doesn't eagerly want it. Why is that such a terrible thing? Because if you really believe in something, if someone tells you, I'm going to give you $1,000,000, you're going to have everything that you want, materially, emotionally, spiritually, and you say, well, big deal, then either you don't believe it, or it shows that you just have no appreciation for something that's good. So when we ask for the redemption, we ask it speedily, and the main reason is, the strongest reason is, for the sake of your name. There's a commentary called Eitz Yosef. It's a commentary on the prayer book. It's also on the Talmud. He says something very interesting. The Talmud tells us, reconciling its contradiction in the Torah. God tells Abraham, the future, that his children will be slaves, be persecuted in a foreign land. And he says 400 years. If you make the calculations of how many years the Jews were in Egypt, and the calculations are very easy to make because the Torah tells you exactly how long each of the patriarchs lived and how old Joseph was when he was sold into Egypt. When Joseph was born, we know exactly how old Jacob was when Joseph was born. We know how old Jacob was when he comes to Egypt, and it tells us when he died. And we know when the Exodus occurred, because it says so in the Torah also when it happened. After all the calculations, the Jews were in Egypt 210 years. 190 years were shaved off the 400 years. How does one account for that? God says 400, and yet we were only in Egypt, the word only is relative here, for 210 years. And it's interesting, 190 in Hebrew, if you indicate it with letters, is the word kates. Kates means the deadline, the end. That God provided the end sooner than it was supposed to come. In other words, there was a fixed time, and it was accelerated. So we already have a model for that, a fixed time and an accelerated coming. But why was it accelerated? Did the Jews do something very special? Some would argue, yes, there was something special about the Jews, and that's one explanation. But the most popular explanation is it was the difficulty of their exile. God did not say how badly they will be treated in Egypt. So even though it was decreed that they will be slaves in Egypt, Maimonides writes, why were the Egyptians punished? Actually, Maimonides gives a different answer. Maimonides says because God didn't tell them to do it. If God says, I want this person punished, this person will be punished, will suffer, it doesn't give you a right to do it, unless he tells you to do it. But the Raavad, Maimonides' critic, if I'm not mistaken, gives a different reason. He says, yes, it was true. They were destined to be slaves, but a slave doesn't have to be tortured. A slave doesn't have to be murdered. The slavery, the pain and suffering was so intense that the 400 years of slavery was compacted and consolidated in 210 years. Well, that's true about our exile as well. When we say, redeem us, wage our battle, redeem us speedily, because we have gone through such suffering, and therefore you have to bring the redemption. There's a fascinating passage in the Talmud that God administered oaths to the Jews and to the nations of the world. One of the oaths to the nations of the world was, don't oppress the Jews, don't overly hurt them. They will be in exile because they didn't behave, but don't harm them. And then God gave the Jews an oath, and the oath is, don't try to pressure me for the redemption. So the commentaries say those two oaths were connected. if the nations of the world would have kept their side of the bargain, and they would have kept us in their land, and they wouldn't have oppressed us, then we wouldn't have a right to really push. Incidentally, this is one of the reasons many Jews were opposed to the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, because one of the oaths went along with this other oath that I mentioned, was not to take Israel by force until Mashiach comes. And many argued that yes, that oath did exist, but that oath was no longer in effect because the nations of the world, especially if you look at what happened during the Holocaust, violated their oath in the most most serious way, in the most extreme way, and therefore we're not bound by our oath. But that's a separate discussion. But the point over here is that when we ask God to bring us to redemption speedily, to accelerate the process, that's because the nations of the world accelerated and exaggerated the degree to which they were entitled to keep us under their domination. And just today I saw something very interesting. In this week's Torah portion, it says, "Vayimareru es chayehem." They embittered their lives. That expresses the bitterness of the slavery in Egypt. Now, in the Torah, the words have musical notes, and the musical notes are supposed to reflect the mood of the word. Now, the musical notes of "Vayimareru es chayehem" is kadma v'azla. "Vayimareru es chayehem." It's a joyous note. Kadma means hasten, go ahead. V'azla, it's an energetic, it's an upbeat type of note. But it's very not upbeat. They embitter their lives. So I just saw today one Hasidic master once said that the words kadma v'azla, the note is called kadma, going forward and going, has a numerical value of the word kates, the deadline, 109, which is 190. That the bitterness of exile actually accelerated the redemption. So that's kadma, means to accelerate. That the bitterness accelerated the ketz, accelerated the deadline. And that's what we're asking for over here. God, accelerate the deadline. We're not asking for bitter exile. We already had it. And therefore, we have a right to say, accelerate it. And it's interesting, this prayer was composed over 2,000 years ago. So even at that point, they felt that it could be accelerated. Certainly now. Then we say, for you, God, are a strong redeemer. What's the difference between a redeemer and a strong redeemer? What's wrong with just saying God is a redeemer? Why do we have to say he's a strong redeemer? Well, the difference between a human redeemer and a divine redeemer is that a human redeemer can give no guarantees. No guarantee that you'll remain redeemed. God could put a guarantee on it. He can make it a final redemption. So if we just ask God to redeem us, it may not be final. We were redeemed from Egypt, and it was not final. We went back into exile. So here we're asking God, we're already used to being redeemed temporarily just to go into exile again. And this again relates to this week's Torah portion. Moses is arguing with God. God is telling him, go get the Jews out of Egypt. I want you to be my messenger. And Moses says to God, what should I tell him is your name? And God says, the name in Hebrew means I will be. I will be who I will be. And Rashi explains, I will be with them in this exile and liberate them from it, and I will be with them in the future exiles and liberate them. And Moses, incredulous, he says to God, you mean I'm going to tell them that they're going to be liberated, but they'll go into exile again? They're not going to be very very happy about that. So God says, no, just tell them the first part. I will be with them. I'm just telling you that. You should know the future. So when we say we want God to be a strong redeemer, we mean the type of redemption that doesn't go back again to exile conditions. The future redemption will be a permanent one. We will sing Shir Chadash, a new song, which is the masculine word for song. So the Midrash says, why is it masculine? Why isn't it Shira Chadasha, which is used in other places, the feminine form of song? And the Midrash says, because just like a man cannot bear a child, the same way the redemption will not bear a child. That means we will not have to be redeemed again. It's a dead end in a positive way. It's a living end, not a dead end. We will be redeemed permanently. So that possibly is what it means by saying you're a strong redeemer, strong as in masculine, that it's a final redemption and it will not be repeated again because there won't be a need for it. You won't go in exile again. Another way of looking at the word strong, redemption is about overcoming obstacles. There are many obstacles to redemption. One obstacle is God's own system. Passover, what is the meaning of Passover? God passed over what? He jumped over houses? I mean, does God have to jump over a house? So the deeper understanding of that is he jumped over his own system of judgment because there were indictments against many of the Jews that they were no better than the Egyptians. They were idol worshippers, just like the Egyptians. And they had very little redeeming qualities. So God's attribute of justice said, what's the difference? Why are you sparing them and allowing the Egyptians to die? So God had to pass over not just the homes. That's easy stuff. That's kid stuff for God. You have to pass over his own system. Override your own system? That's difficult. That's not easy. That's why it says the splitting of the sea is the symbol of difficulty. Whenever the Talmud wants to say something was difficult, miracle was difficult, it uses that as the model. Why is that so difficult? Because God creates a system, it's his own system, and he overrides it. It's like the principal of a school creates rules and he violates all his rules because he has a kid in the school who should be thrown out and punished severely, but because it's his kid, he says, forget about my rules. It's my kid. And that's what we're asking God. God, forget about your rules. We're your kid. Get us out. So that's what it means. It's a strong redemption, strong redeemer, that he's strong, that he can overpower his own system, his own rules for the sake of redemption, if need be. The truth is, he doesn't have to override anything because we deserve it. At this point, after going through what we went through for thousands of years, as a people, we deserve the redemption. But even if you feel, God, that there's some obstacle to the redemption, you're a strong God. You're a strong Redeemer. You've done it in the past. You've jumped over your own system in the past. You can do it again. And then we say, blessed are you, God, Redeemer of Israel. So the first question I have here is, why emphasize only Israel? He's the Redeemer of the whole world. We say that on Rosh Hashanah, Melech al Kol Haaretz. He's the king of the whole world. So why do we only talk about the Redeemer of Israel? Well, the simple explanation is that we're talking about ourselves. We're asking for ourselves because that's the first thing that a person does is to ask about their own needs. But the deeper explanation is that the key to the redemption of the whole world is the redemption of Israel. As long as we are in exile, then the divine presence is in exile because God follows us. It says when we got into exile, the divine presence went with us. Wherever we go, the divine presence is in exile with us. If the divine presence is in exile, then we have a world, a chaotic world. We have a world of strife. We have a world of chaos. We have a world of, of wars and all sorts of ills. The redemption of Israel is the key to the redemption of the whole world. So we're asking God for the key. Once the key is there, everything else follows suit. Then the question is, why is it used the present tense? Blessed are you, God, Redeemer of Israel, not who has redeemed Israel. That's simple because we're not just talking about the past redemptions. But then why doesn't it talk about the future redemption? Blessed, blessed are you, God, who will redeem Israel. Because this is not, as I said at the very beginning, this is not just about the ultimate redemption. It's also about the personal redemption and the need to be secure even on the road to redemption. It's not enough that we get there. We want the trip to be without any mishap, without any persecution, without any suffering. The trip should also be a redemptive one. We should go to the redemption with the spirit of redemption. And finally, as I said in earlier classes, one of the early commentators, known as the Riva, maintains that all of the intermediate blessings, the 13th is a very general one. So there's 12. There are 6 personal blessings that we ask God as individuals, and 6 that deal with the community at large. So we're up to now, which number? Number 4 of the individual blessings. The first one was for knowledge. Second was to return to God. The third one was forgiveness. And the fourth is redemption. What is the fourth of the communal blessings? It's the one where we ask God to take care of the righteous. We ask God for the righteous, the pious ones, the elders, the righteous converts, that God should take care of them. And we put our trust in God, who's a support for the righteous. How does that parallel the blessing of redemption? Because when we ask God for redemption here, the focus, although it ultimately relates to the entire Jewish people, the focus here is on our individual part of the redemption, personal redemption. The blessing that we ask God for the righteous is we want God to take care of the community of righteous people. So this is more personal, that's more collective for the whole community. But they both refer to God taking care of our needs as we are still in exile, poised to get out of exile. In the Kabbalists tell us that each time we mention God's name, there are different vowels for God's name, and each vowel reflects a different divine attribute. And strangely enough, the divine attribute for this blessing is Gevurah, is God's power of Gevurah, of strength, of judgment, of harshness, of severity. And that raises an obvious question. We're asking God to redeem us. That's kindness. And the vowel, by the way, of judgment is called Shava, the 2 vertical dots that more or less tell you that the syllable is ended. It's the end of something. It's limiting. So why is this blessing Gevurah? Why is it harshness and judgment? So in Hasidic literature, it says that there are actually at least 4 different forms of Gevurah. The lowest form of Gevurah is when you are harsh, cruel, destructive for the sake of being harsh, cruel, and destructive. That's the lowest form of Gevurah. That's the ruthless individual who enjoys inflicting pain. That's obviously evil. But that's pure harshness. Then there's a level where you do the same thing as the first category. You're tough, you're harsh, but part of it is justified. You're a disciplinarian. You're a tough principal. If we have to use the analogy of principals again, you're a tough disciplinarian. So on one hand, you're doing it because it's your job. You have to bring discipline to the school, but you also enjoy it. You enjoy being tough. That's not pure, unmitigated gevura. That's gevura that has some silver lining to it. Then there's the person who uses gevura, who's a disciplinarian, who doesn't enjoy it, but does it only because it's necessary. Tough love would be the example, the third one. Actually, there's 5 levels. The fourth level is where your kindness is combined with judgment. And it's a sweetened judgment. It's not harsh, but it's not pure kindness. It's not pure judgment either. What? Yeah, you can use that as an example. See the example, benevolent dictator. The example he gives over here in the Hasidic source is a person is doing something proper. He's learning Torah, he's davening, but he's doing it without any passion. Very tranquil, very peaceful. And he's losing some of his enthusiasm, some of his real vigor. So what does he do? He puts some fire into it. Fire is a powerful force. So what that does is it instills some energy, some strong energy into the tranquil, exercise of study or of prayer. But there's a 5th level of Gevurah, because all these other levels could become negative. Any type of Gevurah that you exhibit could lead to something negative. The highest form of Gevurah is when you do something, when you give kindness with total energy and force and kindness. For example, if a person is charitable, you'd say it's a person of chesed. If a person goes to extremes in being charitable, that's a gevura form. That's the ultimate highest form of gevura. It's chesed on, what's the word? On steroids. Chesed on steroids is the highest form of gevura. And that's the type of gevura we're asking God to exhibit here. We're asking him to give us unmitigated kindness, so strong that it's stronger than kindness itself. It's the gevura form of kindness.
In this case, gevura, we translate it as energy or like emphasis.
The word gevura itself means might, strength, power,
Exactly, yeah.
judgment, severity, discipline. All these words are used interchangeably for gevura. But in this context, this 5th level, this highest level, is chesed on steroids, unmitigated kindness. Kindness with such a flow that nothing can stand in its way. That's what we want here, because there are so many obstacles to redemption, personal and communal redemption. We want God to overcome all the obstacles, or as I said before, when God stands, as it were, figuratively speaking, of course, that means he's bringing the highest form down to the lowest place. And that's what this blessing is. Are there any questions?
This thing where they were saying that Hashem passed over his attribute of judgment
Right.
in the Passover to save the Jews, even though they were not too different. But isn't there did that start there, or according to one opinion, it started by the time Abraham came out of the 70 nations and standing up, said, I'm going to follow Hashem. The fact that he did that imprinted on his future generations that Hashem would
Redeem.
single them for this special treatment, even
Right.
though we fail and we do.
Right, but sometimes there's a time when even the patriarchs' devotion to God doesn't help us, depending on how serious our breach is. And even then, we're saying to God, we want you to take away the pain and suffering. So sometimes, because the Talmud says that even the merit of the patriarchs has its limits. There's a very strange passage in the Talmud that Abraham will come to God and try to defend the Jewish people, and God will tell them what we've done wrong. And Abraham doesn't says, well, if that's the case, they should die for the sanctification of your name. And he comes to Jacob and he says the same thing. And he comes to Isaac, and Isaac is the one who works things out with God. Because Isaac had a son, Esau, that he knew it was his son, even though he wasn't such a goody-goody. Mm-hmm. He was able to accept him. So Isaac is the one, even though Isaac is associated with Gevurah, with judgment, Isaac will be the most forgiving. And that's why it says in the future, which of the three patriarchs will we identify with and call him our father Isaac? Not Abraham, not Jacob. So there's a certain limit that even Abraham and Jacob are not willing to defend us to certain people at certain times.
Is this Bach here the musician, or the Bach the Bach that had
this is Rabbi Yoel Sirkish. He was a rabbi in the city of Krakow about 350 years ago. He wrote a commentary on the Torah. The Torah is a major code of Jewish law, the forerunner of the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch was modeled after the Torah. The Torah lived about 600 years ago. Mm-hmm. And the two major commentaries was one of Rabbi Yosef Karo, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch. He first wrote a commentary on the Torah called Beis Yosef, and the Bach wrote another commentary, he lived a little later, and it's one of the major pillars of Jewish law. And in every volume of the Talmud, the Bach is on the margin because he made corrections wherever there were printing mistakes. And every single page of the Talmud, virtually, you have his corrections. He was very, very, I don't know if he was a good musician, if he composed any music, but he was certainly Bach is actually an acronym for his work called Beis Chadash, a new house. And if you take the initials of those two words, it's Bach. Any other questions?
A small one about the connection to Zion, to the letter Zion.
Oh, yeah.
Unless I'm reading it right, there's no appearance of Zion in the actual prayer. The letter doesn't appear.
No, the letter doesn't appear, but the number.
Is there any significance?
Why the letter doesn't appear?
Mm-hmm. It's so strong.
Yes, there is a Zion there. Yeah. The word chazak, strong.
Got it. Never mind.
I was ready to give you another answer, but
That's okay. Because I looked this over a few times.
it's like someone said, why does the Torah begin with an aleph? Well, one reason is because aleph is the first letter of the alphabet. The second reason is it doesn't begin with an aleph. It begins with a bays.
Yeah.
So there is a Zion. It's interesting. I didn't even notice it before, but the next blessing, for example, does not have a Zion in it. The one before does not have a Zion in it. Yeah, the one before that does have. So not every blessing has a Zion. Most don't.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, most don't. But the number 7 is a Zion, and that represents the idea of a weapon. Because you're fighting a war, you're waging war, you're asking God to wage the war for us.
Mm-hmm. It's one of the questions trying to establish when did the phenomenon happen that the Jews were marked for distinction and it stayed as a permanent thing. Was it when Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, was it the time of Jacob or the 12 sons of Jacob or in the time of Egypt and
Well,
Passover? Like,
Abraham was already, we call him the first Jew. That means God already made a covenant with him that he will be the father of this nation that will be chosen at Sinai to be the teachers of godly light to the whole world and bring to fruition God's purpose in creation. In order for God's plan for creation to materialize, he needed a people, he needed a nation that would have the capacity to choose to do the right thing. Even though it's one of the paradoxes, the Jewish people are guaranteed to succeed, yet we have free choice not to succeed. It's like, they take a poll before election day, and the poll says this candidate will get 90% of the vote. There's no way the other guy could win. Does that mean that you have to vote for the winner? No. So we know the outcome. The outcome is inevitable, guaranteed. But every single person, including the candidate himself, has the choice to vote for the other guy, the loser. That's actually an argument Maimonides gives. That an outcome for a group of people doesn't prejudice the free choice of any individual within that group. So while you can guarantee an outcome, it doesn't take away free choice. So God wanted both. He wanted that we should choose to do the right thing. So he can't force us to do it. He can't program us to do it. But he also wanted a guaranteed outcome. And that's what the Jewish people have. We have free choice. In fact, we have more free choice than other people. We are capable of being that candidate who's running for office and he votes for his adversary. We could vote for things that are totally out against our own interests, as we have shown. No other nation is so capable of doing stupid things as we are. That means that our free choice is really very powerful. What does real free choice mean? Real free choice means you can go against your program. If I'm hungry I want a steak and there's some tofu there, and I choose the steak, with all due respect to the vegans here, that's not a free choice. I don't like tofu. I like steak. So that's my program. So I just followed my program. I could choose to breathe or to stop breathing. That's not a choice. I can't. That's my nature. Free choice means that I can go against my nature, that I will choose the tofu rather than the steak because I have free choice. And Jews have demonstrated that they're capable of choosing the opposite of their nature. Yet, we are also so programmed as a people that inevitably ultimately we will come around doing the right thing sooner or later. But it's guaranteed that we will succeed.
So would you say that even though Abraham was chosen, the confirmation happened what at Pesach in Messiah, or at the giving of the Torah,
It's
or
in
was it from
stages.
the stages?
It's stages. The Rogachover, the great Talmudic genius of the early 20th century, in responding to the controversy as to whether Abraham was a Jew or the identity of a Jew began with Sinai. And he says they're both true. And he doesn't use the stages argument. He says when the Torah was given at Mount Sinai and the Jewish people, descendants of Abraham, accepted it, retroactively Abraham became the first Jew because he was the one who made it happen. So until Sinai, he was not a Jew because a few individuals don't make a people. No guarantee of anything. When we accepted the Torah, that retroactively conferred upon him the status of one of the Jewish people.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? So just 3 lines. There's a lot in these 3 lines, and there's a lot more, I'm sure.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you. Thank you so much. What's the next one?
Next week